We already have an interface which looks similar to the one in the picture. However, we'd also like the button to have another color. We could simply set a color on the button using the variable background. Android supports full ARGB, so we can define colors using the alpha red green blue form, where alpha is optional and we can skip it if we don't specify the transparency. However, there is one problem with a component created this way. After starting our application, we can see that our button does not respond. Its color doesn't change when pressed. This doesn't mean that the button is not activated. If we attach something under the given button, we see that it's still active. This results from the fact that we have set the red value as the background. Regardless of the button state, it'll always be red. That is why it's good to set a selector. A selector is a simple tool which makes it possible to specify the graphics which are to be used in such situations. Thanks to this, we can, for instance, determine that when clicking the button, a different graphic has to be called than in the case the button hasn't been clicked. To use a selector, we have to create it. A selector is just a drawable, that is, a resource which we can create the same way we've created the translation. However, this time we don't want to create a value, but a drawable. We also have to specify what the main element is supposed to be like. Currently, the default main element is the selector, which is what we wanted to obtain. We can also specify the name. I recommend a descriptory name. As we want to use our selector at all times, no matter on which device it is started, let's leave the drawable version. Thanks to this, the file will be placed in the default directory and will be loaded each time. After clicking the OK button, the selector object is created. It's a construction which looks similarly to a switch break. It means that the file is browsed from top to bottom until the first matching element is encountered. Due to this, the elements which are most detailed should be placed at the top. Going down, we describe more general elements, and at the very bottom there is the default element, which is used if no other element is matched. In our case, we must put item there. In case of selectors, we specify the parameters based on the state which has to be used. In our case, we want to react at the moment of clicking. That's why we're interested in state pressed set to true. It will be the element called the moment the button is clicked. If we haven't clicked the button, it's in another state, so we have to create a default item. It's good to remember that more detailed elements, which include, for instance, 2 actions, have to be placed at the top. If we placed it under a more general element, it would never be called, because each time the general part with one action would be called. Luckily, when checking, LINK is able to automatically determine whether any of the elements may never be reached. We already have the main construction, which will switch depending on the state. Now we need to specify the values which will be switched in these states. To do so, we insert a drawable inside the element. Here we can specify, for instance, the color and inform that the moment the button is pressed, the drawable will become the specified color. In our case, we can use a slightly more advanced trick. The element which we'll put inside our selector is a shape. It's a simple element which is responsible for drawing a certain shape. Usually, it's a rectangle for which certain items can be specified. We can, for instance, specify a solid, that is, the filling color. Stroke, that is, the frame color, as well as corners. In case of corners, we can specify their radius. Such a prepared element will be displayed. In order to enhance the code readability, we may separate colors as resources. To do so, we create a new file with values, for instance, named colors. In case of a value, the name doesn't matter. Again, the element will not react to any value changes. It will be default for all devices. In the new file, we may specify the colors by entering the name for the color attribute and providing its value from the previous file. The resources with colors created this way can already be used in the code. Android Studio has the possibility of previewing elements. Unfortunately, it's not able to handle various states. It's only able to render the default state. When moving the value we specified for the pressed state to the default state, we see the created element. We see that no frame has appeared because the frame width was not specified. After small changes, the frame becomes visible. If we're dealing with an element which is not pressed, we don't want to see the frame. We can obtain it in a couple of ways. We can change its size, but also its color. If we set the color to transparent, the element will not appear. We could define the color on our own or insert it in the ARGB form. But there is a much better approach, namely to use the existing constants built in the system. To get to these constants, we need to call the @Android prefix, enter the type of the resource we want to refer to, for instance, color, and then we get the entire list of colors. For instance, transparent. This color causes the element to become transparent. We already have a selector which has the pressed state and the default state. In case of the pressed state, we have a green background and a violet frame. Now let's use the selector in our code. Instead of the red button, which didn't react, we'll use a selector. Given that it's a drawable element, we'll refer to it using a @drawable. In the preview, we immediately see the default value. After starting the application, we see our green button, which has a violet frame after clicking. In the next module, we'll deal with handling clicking and downloading data from text fields.